Democratic Alliance hosting its elective conference this weekend, and that's where its current leader, John Steenhuisen, is seeking a second term at the helm. 3 years ago, you'll remember that Steenhuisen won against the former member Mbalintuli, and should he win this time around, he's expected to claw back the party's electoral losses of the 2019 general elections. Newzroom Afrika's Ziyanda Ngcobo is with John Steenhuisen now. Ziyanda, good morning to you. So, if John does retain this seat, the position of leader of DA, what tricks does he have up his sleeve in order to grow the electoral base?
Well, that's exactly what we're here to find out, isn't it, Xoli? And the official opposition has quite a lot of work to do, both internally but also insofar as its contributions towards the political landscape. And Mr. Steenhuisen, welcome to Newzroom Afrika.
Thank you, Ziyanda.
You've got a mammoth task on your hands here. 2024 is around the corner, but many still feel that the DA is still not a viable option. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I don't think that is borne out by the polling that one looks at, which shows us in some instances up to 10% behind the ANC. And I think that shows that there is a growing confidence in the DA. But also, it's telling to notice that no analyst talks about a post-ANC future in South Africa that doesn't have the DA at the heart of that. And really no game change is going to be possible in the post-2024 environment that doesn't have the DA somewhere in the puzzle piece. So I think we've come a long way since 2019, where we had a bit of a setback in the polls. I think we've set about repairing what was wrong. And I think people look at the DA now and see a party that is very clear about what it stands for, very clear about where it wants to take the country, but also has proof points about where it governs that shows that many of those policies work.
Very clear about what it wants is actually where I was going to go, because when the former leader, Mmusi Maimane, left, he said, that he had failed in his mission to attract the black voter as a part of, your party's values of non-racialism. And, some would say that the DA is getting whiter under John Steenhuisen.
Well, that's not borne out by the facts. And if you look at the recent SRF analysis of political party support base, it shows that the Democratic Alliance's support base is roughly divided into thirds: white South Africans, black South Africans, and Indian and coloured South Africans. That poll concluded, and the study concluded, that we have by far, out of all of the political parties, the most diverse support base. So I'm comfortable that we are moving in the right direction, and that I'm confident that our party, able to put on the table workable solutions to the problems that everyday South Africans are going through, I think is going to be able to win over more supporters who are desperate in unemployment, desperate in poverty, and sitting with load shedding every single day of their lives.
I'm asking this because, the question here is, are you consolidating the white vote? In particular, it's common cause that the DA had lost, some of its voters to the Freedom Front Plus. Now, there's been some kind of, not an allegation, but some would say that when you look at the leaders in your local government, it's predominantly white and male. Is that part of your strategy?
No, it's not part of the strategy, and it would be a very foolhardy strategy for any party. Many people say, you've got to consolidate the base or have growth. Yes. I don't see it as that. I don't see it as an either or. I see it as an and. Of course, you have to look after your anchor tenants as your base. A political party would be silly not to do that. But you would be equally suicidal if you weren't looking to grow the party. We have a variety of mayors of different colours and shades and cultures and languages across the country. So yes, there are some who are white mayors, but they're there because they are meritorious and excellent. I look at someone like Chris Papas, for instance, in Umgeni municipality in KwaZulu-Natal, the first DA-run municipality in that province. He's a white South African, and yet he is doing more in the year that he has been elected for the people of Mpopameni in terms of electricity, fixing potholes and providing opportunities than the ANC government did in the decades when they ran that municipality. So it's not necessarily the colour of the person at the top that matters. It's what they do and how they do it that makes the difference.
So what exactly then is your target, Mr. Steenhuisen? If you were to be re-elected this weekend, that leaves you with less than 18 months before the general elections.
So there's a number of goals. Firstly, you need to turn out your base, because that's what every political party around the world needs to do. But secondly, you've got to make an appeal to people who have opted out of the system and who don't see politics as a solution to their problems. And unfortunately, in the South African context, that's younger voters between the ages of 18 to 35 who've just opted out the system. We need to make the case to them that politics matters about every aspect of their lives, from the electricity switch they switch on in the morning, the tap they put on to brush their teeth if they're lucky enough to have water in their homes, the road they drive, to a job if they have one. So politics affects every aspect of life. And thirdly, there's those swing voters who are unhappy in the parties where they are now and who are potentially available to opposition voters. Obviously, the greatest opportunity for a party like the DA lies in the middle section, the 18 to 35-year-olds, who studies show are 40% more likely to switch their vote to an opposition party if you make the case to them. So that's where we've really got to focus our attention. A party that goes out just to turn out its base on election day is always going to get what it's always got. You've got to go out and make the case to those swing voters in the middle about how you can improve their lives and build a better future for them, and that's how you get growth as a political party.
Are you under any pressure in the same way your predecessor, Mmusi Maimane, was in terms of the actual results? So when I say target, I'm talking numbers. So, in the 2014 general election, you were sitting at around 26%. You dropped, and you're now sitting, in the early 20s. Where exactly do you want to be sitting, given how many would argue that the ANC has given you many, many opportunities for you to be capitalizing, and yet the numbers not so much?
Well, I'd like to see growth from what we got in the last local government elections. In 2019, we got just below 22%, got up to just 23% in the following election. I'd like to see progressive growth on that. Obviously, we'd like to make a major breakthrough. And as you're right, I think the environment is ripe now for opposition parties to capitalize, particularly on things like load shedding, where you've seen that reach into every home and it discriminates against nobody, rich or poor, black or white, urban or rural. It's affecting everybody's opportunities and lives the same way. So there is an opportunity, and I think a party that's able to put on the table solutions to problems like that is going to win over support of people who may not have voted before or have been apathetic, because they are energized by the fact that there is a lack of energy in the economy and in our country.
Because at a practical level, isn't it, that would need to happen at local government, which is the coalface of service delivery. It sounds like you're talking about ramping up service delivery to extend your reach. And it goes back to my earlier question about whether or not the DA is becoming whiter under your leadership. You've taken Celius Brink, you've brought him from Parliament, you've put him in Tshwane, where there's largely an Afrikaans space. You've got Jordan Hill-Lewis, a white male there. You've got Retief Odendaal in Nelson Mandela Bay. So in terms of attracting the young black voter, 18 to 34, as you've already mentioned, how would that look like in terms of local government with these coalition politics really not seemingly to be consolidated at this stage? Do you have a framework?
Well, again, we don't look at people and say, well, we need a black person here and a white person there and an Indian person here and a coloured person there. And I think if you look at our mayors as a collective, you will see that diversity. Peter Texera in Midvaal, one of our most successful municipalities in Gauteng, is not a white South African. Neither was Mpopalatse, and neither are a number of our mayors from Memory Boyson to others around the country. I think that what there has been is an active process to promote and empower young black South Africans within the Democratic Alliance. Take, for example, Saviwe Garube. She is the first black chief whip of the opposition. I think she's the youngest chief whip of the opposition that we've had. And she's there because she's an excellent chief whip. Not because she is a black South African, but it helps. And when you put her alongside people like Solly Malatsi, you put like Loyolo Mpiti, Mimi Gondwe, Eleanor Bowspies, young South Africans across the board, people start to see something of themselves represented in the DA. Saviwe occupies the most powerful position in the parliamentary operation, and she's there and doing an excellent job. And I think when people see that, they see something of themselves represented in the DA, and that's what I want to see. Because I don't think it should be about who the leader is. It should be about what does the team look like. Because a leader can't do anything on their own. They need a team around them that's able to. And I'm very comfortable with where we're heading in terms of the diversity in the DA. And I think when you look at the Congress outcomes this weekend, you're going to see the same.
Sure. I mean, what is your coalition framework? Do you have one? The DA has been accused, whether it's Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, or Tshwane, that you are arrogant, that because you're the official opposition, you feel you're unable to actually be mature enough to understand the nature of coalition politics. Your assessment as the leader, as a coalition future is really looming large on this country.
Well, look, I would say that when you look at coalitions, you've got to look at them holistically. We're involved in, I think, around 38 coalitions around the country. By far the majority of them, 90%, they are stable, effective, they work. And they include places like George, places like Swellendam, places like Struisbaai, and they work well. And you never hear any drama from them because the coalitions are working. I think where the problem comes is when you've got these multi-party coalitions where you have small fractional parties that are part of the coalition. And I think there's been a misunderstanding from some of those parties that bring 0.65% to the table, that they are suddenly now, they're an equal partner. And I think that makes things difficult. And that's why they say the DA is arrogant. You can't, for instance, like we had in the coalition in Johannesburg, sit around a table and say, oh, well, the majority of the coalition members think that the PA should be brought on and the DA is outvoted. That's not how a coalition works. Same as a company. If a company takes over another company and it becomes a minority shareholder, it doesn't have the same say at an AGM. And I think that there's got to be a maturing of that. So yes, the DA doesn't get it right all the time, and sometimes we have made mistakes, and we must learn from those in terms of being able to bring people together and hold those coalitions together. We're not perfect, and we're a party made up of human beings. But I would say that I think there needs to be a maturing of the political environment where people are putting the interests of the people of the city first, not the narrow self-interest, particularly when it comes to the fraction parties.
I find it quite interesting that you've used that analogy of a shareholder, because some would say that actually you're displaying that very same arrogance by saying that, a smaller party can't tell a bigger party what to do, even within this multi-party coalition. But at the same time, the argument can be made that you didn't win an outright majority, and therefore at the coalition table, you are all equal. So whether or not you've got 20 seats and the PA has, 1 seat, you may need that very 1 seat to be able to govern, no?
Yes, of course. But that doesn't mean that each little party has exactly the same sway. I mean, you've agreed to form a coalition. And conversely, none of those parties would have been at the table had they not brought the DA on board with its 22, 23%. So there needs to be an understanding that there is a majority shareholder and there are minority shareholders, and that you've got to try and keep things together. But a coalition cannot then be 3 or 4 smaller parties ganging up against the bigger party and then trying to undermine it and being able to make life difficult for it and clogging up the machine to such a degree that it takes 13 months to appoint a city manager, where you have to go into each council meeting worrying whether everyone in the coalition is going to be voting with you. And I think you've seen that playing out in Tshwane. So I think that we need to mature when it comes to those coalitions. And there's work to be done on the DA side. As I said, I'm not, for instance, saying we purer than the driven snow. We've made mistakes. And
what are those mistakes?
Well, I think sometimes that there's been a less of an effort to bring smaller partners along with us, and a lot of that's been personality based, and certainly in Tshwane that was one of the big issues and complaints of some of the coalition partners, an unwillingness to listen to some of the other viewpoints. That was some of the concerns. And obviously, as we find our way in these coalitions, we must tease out where these problems lie and try and put in place mechanisms to deal with them. Would I ever say that it is getting better? If I compare coalitions 1.0, the 2016 ones, with coalitions 2.0, the 2021 ones, I think there's already been a lot more progress and stability than we saw prior to that. And so I think parties are finding each other. It is a new thing, and it's antithetical to many parties, because here you suddenly find yourself around a table with one of your opponents, and you have to make it work.
So there's no, framework as it stands for the
We have a framework that we will go into coalitions after the 2024 election. We will seek, obviously, to bring the ANC below 50% because there will be no change in town if we don't achieve that. And that should actually be the goal of all the opposition parties. And then we will seek to form coalitions with like-minded parties around 4 key values and principles: non-racialism, respect for the rule of law and the Constitution, a social market economy that treats business and the private sector as partners in the growth agenda, and building a capable state free of cadre deployment. Those are the 4 key values and principles that we would use as sort of the framework to which we bring people together. And obviously then you would look at thrashing out coalition agreements as we did in this last round of Coalitions 2.0. It's no use, as some people say, just lumping everybody into one pot. If you layer the EFF's 7 pillars over those 4 values and principles, you'll see they're incongruous. The EFF, support cadre deployment. They don't want a market economy. And it will make a partnership incredibly difficult when the core values and principles of parties differ so much. So we will reach out to like-minded parties to try and form something to stop the ANC from getting a majority and preventing that slide to a failed state.
Which parties are you looking at?
Well, we'll look at any party well, if they ascribe to the 4 values and principles, they're welcome to the table. These are the non-negotiables for the DA. There's one thing worse than not getting into government, and that's getting into government and not being able to govern according to your values and principles, and then acting in the same way as the government that you've replaced. And that doesn't take us forward. So you need to get in, and you need to have a principle and value set that will differentiate you from the people that you've displaced from office. And we've seen that very, very clearly, that when you get into situations like we did in Coalition 1.0 in Joburg, where you're not able to govern according to your values and principles, when you've got coalition partners knocking on the door saying, hey, appoint this person into this position, give us this fleet contract, give us that, you can't govern then in a different way to the predecessor party that you've displaced. And it makes it very, very difficult to really differentiate your government from the government of your predecessor.
Speaking of the city of Johannesburg, the former mayor, Mpho Phalatse, she'll be going up against you this weekend. And she said, firstly, one, that you're a hypocrite. For an example, I was with you in Tshwane when you were picketing outside Brantarian ministerial estates, and that even your own officials such as Premier Alan Winde, they live in state houses, for an example, but also that, the breakdown in communication and losing Johannesburg was as a result of, a lack of understanding from the leadership of the DA of the dynamics in Johannesburg, and perhaps even personal, because she's married to someone who's part of Action SA.
Well, let me start by saying, whoever anybody in the DA is married to is nobody else's business. And I don't care who people are married to. It's their private lives, and they must get on with it. And that's never been a consideration.
Personalities being largely part of the problem why the DA has not necessarily worked.
Who someone is married to is a determination of their personality. It's a relationship factor. Secondly, Mayor Phalatse and her Chief of Staff, Mark Moriarty, were involved in every one of the strategy meetings that we had in dealing with the Johannesburg dynamics. They were every step of the way briefed. They participated in the meetings. They put forward their viewpoints. Many of them were shared with us. So I disagree with that assertion. And the public record will show that very, very clearly when those meetings were, who was present, and how that was determined. It was very unfortunate what happened in Joburg. But I am not going to allow on my watch double dealing to be taking place behind the party's back with parties like the EFF, because we saw what happened when we were in that situation in 2016 under the former Mayor Herman Mashaba, where we ended up dancing to the EFF's tune because we were reliant on them to stay in power. And that is why we took that principled stance against the PA, but also against doing a backroom deal with the EFF, particularly when we told voters that. Let me say to you, I'm not a hypocrite. I have never had a bodyguard and driver. When I inherited the party, the leader had a party car and a party bodyguard, I got rid of those immediately. I believe that if you really believe yourself to be relatable, you shouldn't need people to separate you from the people that you represent. And I think that in South Africa, we've got to this situation where public representatives seem to think they're rock stars and that they must live this rock star lifestyle separated. It is very out of track with the rest of the world, where many prime ministers travel to work on their own steam. The Dutch prime minister travels on a bicycle. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson travelled on tube. Of course, someone like a premier, a president, someone who's the centerpiece, needs to have the protection and is entitled to some form of official residence. But I think the grotesque spending, 8 billion rand a year on VIP protection services, the billions we're spending on the mansions for ministers, the millions we're spending on generators and water supply, so they don't have to feel the ill effects of their own policies, I think is revolting in the face of 30 million people living in poverty, 42% of our people unemployed, and with children dying in pit latrines because we can't get decent sanitation. And I think we need to rein that in. It needs to come to an end, and we need to start living with our people. As Charlotte McClake famously said, never rise above your people. And I think that's an important lesson for politicians to remember.
Let's talk then about your economic justice policy. That's one of the policies of the party going into this Congress that will be discussed this weekend. And the DA has long rejected BEE, and you've also rejected the trickle-down policy. Do you think that with scrapping, BEE and cadre deployment, that you are not shooting yourselves in the foot? You've taken the matter to court, the cadre deployment issue, but insofar as trying to capitalize off the weaknesses of the ANC, for an example, is this the way to go?
Yes, I do think it's the way to go, because it's the only way we're going to be able to focus policy and economic redress where it's needed the most. What we've seen with the ANC's model of economic redress particularly is a transfer from one elite to another elite. And that is why we still have 30 million people living in poverty. Let's use VBS Bank, for example. There was a black-owned bank, but it didn't shield black depositors from the corruption and maladministration. So I think that what the government's policy and where they've gone wrong, and I think the intentions were always good, but you've got to measure every policy by its outcome. And the outcome of government's trickle-down policy is that black households are 10% poorer than they were before the programs were implemented. Black unemployment has risen exponentially. So we want to focus not on an equality of outcome, but an equality of opportunity. And that's why we use the Sustainable Development Goals as the measure of the basic things that you need to do to give people a equality of opportunity so that you start to level the playing fields. And these things like early childhood development, a quality education, access to universities, being able to get a decent job, being able to get onto the housing ladder. These are the areas where we should be focusing on assisting those 30 million people. If you also use the Sustainable Development Goals as the measure and the poverty line of 992 Rand a month, 33 Rand a day as the measure, your policies are then focused on the people that need them the most. And you're not just simply re-empowering the same people who've benefited from contract after contract, and where you simply have an elite getting richer and the inequality gap growing. So I think that we've got to try something different. That's the key point. Whatever is being implemented now is not working. We're not dealing with unemployment. We're not dealing with poverty. And the inequality gap is widening, not narrowing. So we've got to try something different. And we believe fundamentally that if you focus your policy suite and your empowerment on those 30 million South Africans, 99.7% of whom are black South Africans, you will really start to move the needle in terms of giving people opportunity. And then you don't have to try and manage the outcome. You're managing the input.
I mean, the DA has long sort of trying to move away from classification through race, etc. But then when you look at an example, the gender inequality and inequities, what is your policy around that and the disparities, for instance, when it comes to the pay of women?
Yeah, of course. We believe fundamentally in equal pay. And as the only mainstream political party that's ever been led by a woman, we've always fought really hard to ensure that there is that equality. I'm also very lucky in Parliament to be the only male in my leadership team. I've got a female chief whip, a female caucus chair, a female deputy chief whip, and a female leader in the NCOP. So we believe that there should be an equity in pay. It is iniquitous that sports women are paid less than sportsmen. The job should have a pay grade, and regardless of your color, regardless of your culture, regardless of your gender, that should be the pay grade that's paid, and everyone should be paid at that.
All right, John Steenhuisen, thank you so much. All the best for the weekend.
Thank you.
That's John Steenhuisen. He is, of course, running for a second term as federal leader of the official opposition, the Congress, taking place this weekend.